Hi, I'm Bart Everson, creative generalist here at the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Faculty Development. And there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. It's your ethics, or to be more precise, the prospect of ethical education with artificial intelligence. Now, as I prepared for this, I realized ethics often takes a back seat with regards to technology. Unfortunately, at least I noticed that I've been prone to be attracted to the latest shiny thing and plunge in with the excitement of something new, and only come around to the ethical considerations a little bit later in the game. And that got me to wonder, why is that? Why do we wait sometimes to talk about ethics? Possibly because it's a little unpleasant, a little frightening, because ethics is really, it seems to me, about a lot of risks, about things that can go wrong, about doing harm. And we don't want to do harm. And there are so many risks associated with artificial intelligence that I had to even start wondering, can it be done? On the other hand, can we afford to ignore it? Clearly not. So artificial intelligence seems to offer great potential, but also great risk. It's like an epic adventure. First and foremost, for a lot of people early on, certainly, academic integrity was one of the ethical concerns around artificial intelligence. Well, I'm not going to talk too much about that because we've got other programming for you about that. We've addressed that elsewhere. Another risk relates to learner autonomy, or more precisely, the loss of learner autonomy, the fear of the loss of learner autonomy. And I asked an artificial intelligence platform, I believe it was Microsoft Copilot, to illustrate this. And I got this illustration, which I found just so striking and kind of troubling. You see the chains there, the books are locked up, and the student seems to be constrained by the curriculum, by standardized tests, by institutional rules. This hit a little close to home. So I had to refine this and specify, no, I mean loss of learner autonomy because of artificial intelligence. And here's a different illustration. I think a lot of us understand implicitly that this is a basic risk, a basic fear that we have, is that our students will become less autonomous. If we ask them to use these artificial intelligence tools, they become dependent upon them. Almost like some kind of robot zombies. Again, if you have made the decision to teach with artificial intelligence, I'm assuming that you are already grappling with this issue, and there's certainly no easy answers. So I'm just going to highlight that, name it, and move on. Data privacy is one of the big concerns, I feel, in the ethical use of AI. So we're going to get into this one in a little more depth. It bears mentioning somewhere, so I'm going to say it here, that you do have to have parental permission for the use of ChatGPT if you're under the age of 18, between 13 and 18 years of age, which includes some of our youngest students. Something to be aware of. But more generally, what do these platforms collect? Well, OpenAI collects a lot of data from users. Time zones, countries, the country of where you're located, the dates and times of access, the type of computer or device that you're using, the type of computer connection that you have. If you point your web browser to webk.robinlinus.com, it can give you an indication of just how much data your web browser can transmit to almost anyone as you surf the web. And OpenAI collects that data. Also, OpenAI also collects any information that you input as data. So if you write a prompt, including any personally identifiable information about your students, it keeps that data. And it is a possible FERPA violation. And likewise, if you ask a student to use ChatGPT to revise a college admissions essay that includes information about a trauma that they experienced, well, OpenAI collects and keeps that data. And what do they do with it? Quite simply, they use your data to make more money, or as they call it, to improve their products. But you can opt out of having your data used. And you might have to search, though, buried somewhere in the settings. And way down at the bottom of their privacy policy, they note that they also are collecting geolocation data. I mentioned before that they're collecting, what country you're in and so forth, but geolocation is much more precise. And depending on what you have turned on in your web browser or your device, it can really pinpoint where you are. Now, I've just been talking here about ChatGPT, the product from OpenAI. What about other products? What about Gemini specifically? That's one of the most popular ones. That's Google's product. Well, all of the same things more or less apply to Google's Gemini. And I hate to say it, but Microsoft's Copilot seems to be better in some ways. Now, Microsoft says it does not claim ownership, but any prompts that you input into Copilot, anything you create with Copilot, they can use without paying you however they see fit. In other words, to make more money. So if your students come up with a super amazing prompt that turns Copilot into a tutor for your class, Microsoft can use that prompt so they can sell it, share it. To recap, ChatGPT requires parental permission. ChatGPT and Gemini can give away any data collected to affiliates and even legal authorities. And of course, it should be noted that law enforcement and intelligence agencies routinely buy data from brokers. Microsoft and Google have more data privacy protections for users thanks to the GDPR in Europe. Google tracks user locations. OpenAI collects IP addresses. Microsoft Copilot doesn't seem to collect location data. Don't let students put any sensitive data or identifying information into any of these tools. And don't you put any sensitive information into these tools. It could be a FERPA violation. And of course, any information that you put into these tools is data that can be used by the companies that made the tools. This applies to the big corporate models that we've been talking about. If you use open source products, you might find better data privacy considerations. Some possible recommendations then. Use Gemini or Copilot instead of ChatGPT since they have stronger data protections. Ask students to use only one tool because the more tools they use, the more data is collected about them, so consolidate. I don't know about that, but that's one possibility. Use the AI tool only on a teacher, computer, or account. In other words, have them use your account, although sharing your login with students would be a violation of ChatGPT's terms of use. So you'd have to do that on some other platforms. Ask students to use only the AI tools during class time. Only use the AI tools during class time. It protects their location data as compared to using those tools at home for homework. And of course, teach students about the privacy policies and the terms of use. They may not know what's going on unless you tell them. Because, let's face it, people don't tend to read those long terms of use statements. And this segues almost directly into another risk, another question, maybe I should say. Who profits? Can we trust Microsoft, etc.? You could also call this labor issues. Because you'll remember this, OpenAI can use any data it collects from you to improve its services, thus helping them to make more money. In other words, you are providing free labor. They go out of their way to state that you will not be given any compensation for providing feedback, just clicking that thumbs up or thumbs down button on the quality of ChatGPT's output. In other words, you're providing free labor, helping them to train their model. Google can also use any data that it collects from you to improve its services, thus helping it to make more money. In other words, you are providing free labor. Google states that it benefits from your feedback and data. Again, you're providing free labor. Any prompts that you input into Copilot or anything you create with Copilot can be used by Microsoft. They can use your prompts and creations without paying you. In other words, you're providing free labor. And it's not just us and our students. Many companies, including OpenAI, exploit human workers to review and train data for their AI technologies, often in the global south. There is concern about digital sweatshops that are being opened in places like the Philippines to train the model better. Some considerations for you. Talk to your students about it. Engage them in a conversation. Do they think it's ethical for companies to use their data to make more money? Encourage students to investigate the exploitation of data and human labor to improve AI technologies and make AI companies more money. Another risk, another murky, extremely murky, gray area is around copyright or intellectual property issues. You see this picture that had Midjourney generate. Clearly looks like a Batman and Robin illustration. I'm pretty sure that's a copyright violation, but it will do it if I just ask. So companies have gotten rich using copyrighted work taken without their permission. And a battle is now underway, waged against AI platforms by individual creators and publishing giants. Several authors are suing OpenAI for using their copyrighted works to train ChatGPT. The New York Times is suing OpenAI and Microsoft for using its articles to train their AI tools. And there's so many questions. Was it legal for OpenAI to scrape public and often copyrighted content data from the internet for free to train their tool? And who owns the copyright of AI-generated work? There's been some rulings and some policies that have been issued, but it's far from clear if those are going to stay the same as lawsuits work their way through the courts. If AI generated a new idea for a life-saving invention, does the person who wrote the prompt get the copyright or the patent, or does it belong to a company like OpenAI? There's many academic integrity policies out there that state it's okay for students to use text generated from AI as long as they cite it. But should students really be citing AI-generated text when AI tools were designed by stealing copyrighted text from the internet? Should the students go to the original source and cite that? This might be a conversation worth having with your students. Another risk that's gotten a lot of attention is the issue of bias, harmful bias. I'm not really sure how this image illustrates the notion of bias, but it looked kind of cool. It's what I got out of Leonardo AI when I typed in just the idea, harmful bias. I got this picture. I don't know what it means either. Yeah, I like to type prompts into these different platforms and see what comes out. So after seeing what Daniel Stanford had done with a different platform, I tried with Midjourney this prompt: illustration of nurse, doctor, pilot, and professor. And it always, does 4 images at once. So here's what we got, a sampling. And you may notice, these look like nurses, doctors, pilots, and professors. They kind of have an old school, vintage, maybe even steampunk look to them. But there's also another thing that's kind of strange. You may note a general demographic profile. They all appear to be of European heritage. If I modify that prompt by saying with diverse racial representation, just tacking on those words at the end, I get a slightly different kind of illustration, and strangely enough, a slightly more modern feel. So it should really come as no surprise, because of course these chatbots and models and AI platforms are only as good as the data that they're trained on, and the data that they're trained on comes from our society, and our society has a lot of biases embedded into it. So it kind of makes sense, right? Oh, and here's, just to show you that it's not just on Midjourney, here is nurse, doctor, pilot, and professor from Leonardo. And when I add on the with diverse racial representation, I get this. Although all of these people look kind of like they might be in the medical field, and I don't really necessarily see a pilot or a professor in there, but who knows. Here's illustration of nurse, doctor, pilot, and professor from Copilot. By default, I didn't even add anything about diverse racial representation, and one of the 4 images shows what appears to be a woman of color. And there's an airplane flying in the back of what looks to be a medical profession, so, who knows what's going on there. A lot of airplanes. Copilot seemed to want to put airplanes all over the place. So these platforms have what we might call a diversity problem. They also have what I've heard described as a hotness problem. A typical female doctor, you'll notice that all of these representations are maybe a little bit more attractive than the average human being. And that's part of the bias as well, I suppose. And you'll notice also the one doctor in the lower left-hand corner, besides kind of a very weird framing with her eyes halfway cut off, she seems to be missing part of her blouse. But there's other biases in these large language models, including what they've called machine or algorithmic bias, availability bias, representation bias, historical bias, selection bias, group attribution bias, contextual bias, linguistic bias, anchoring bias, automation bias, and confirmation bias. We certainly don't have time to get into all of those, but I will note the Brookings Institute cited linguistic bias, the dominance of big languages. There's this rich diversity of human language is suffering, again, under the current AI regimes, because they're trained on only a few of the languages that have a really rich presence on the internet: English, Spanish, Mandarin. Jill Repberg says that AI is multilingual. It can talk to you in different languages, but it's really monocultural. So it's learning from English sources and translating into other languages. So some considerations for you, some recommendations. You might want to engage students in investigating how generative AI tools are designed. What data are they trained on? Why was that data selected? How will that data produce biased output? You could encourage students to reflect upon how biased AI output can shape thinking, learning, education, society. And as a bonus, why not ask students to design a code of ethics for AI developers in order to reduce the harms done by biased AI output. Misinformation is a risk we've also heard a lot about, haven't we? Including political implications. The Washington Post calls artificial intelligence a misinformation super spreader. Why, in just 65 minutes and with basic prompting, ChatGPT produced 102 blog articles containing more than 17,000 words of disinformation. In other words, it's very easy to use artificial intelligence to set up websites that might look credible to people and to pump lots of information out onto the internet. NewsGuard is tracking artificial intelligence generated news and information websites that spread information. As of the date of this recording, they've already found 815. And AI generated misinformation is been identified as the world's biggest short-term threat by the World Economic Forum. I'm not sure I trust anything they say, but I do believe that they're onto something with this. Of course, using Gemini or ChatGPT to produce false or misleading information is not allowed per their respective policies, but that's probably not going to stop the bad actors. Considerations for you in your teaching. Help your students learn how to identify misinformation, become information literate, and combat the spread of misinformation, because in the 21st century, developing the skill to distinguish between content created by AI and that made by humans will become increasingly crucial. And yes, that phrase was written by artificial intelligence. So I asked the AI what do we do if we can't tell the difference? If distinguishing between AI-generated content and human-created content becomes challenging, it would necessitate a shift in focus. We might need to emphasize the importance of critical thinking and the source of the information rather than the origin of its creation, if you can distinguish between those two. It would also highlight the need for transparent labeling of AI-generated content and the development of tools to help verify the authenticity of information. Ultimately, the goal would be to ensure that regardless of the source, the content is trustworthy and beneficial. I think we've tended to hear less about the environmental impact of artificial intelligence, but it's super important. Noam Chomsky, who you may have heard of, he says that generative AI is basically just a way of wasting a lot of energy in California. And he may be correct about that, except it's not just in California. Artificial intelligence consumes a lot of energy. It also consumes a huge amount of water. And I could go into all kinds of stories that have been written about this. One chart from the Stanford report kind of says it all. Actually, it's a little more alarming at first glance than when you dig into it. But here you see carbon emissions in tons. The air travel from one passenger from New York to San Francisco, as you can see over there on the far left, well, that's hardly anything. In fact, in American life, for 1 year, we do, have a big carbon footprint, Americans, is still minuscule compared to the total carbon emission in tons from GPT-3 alone. However, that might be a little misleading in a sense because, of course, there's a lot more Americans than just one, and that is the total aggregate use of everybody using ChatGPT-3 globally on the internet, I believe. However, it does add up, and that's just one artificial intelligence platform, keeping in mind that there are many. And we're just getting started, apparently, with this brave new world. And another consideration that's starting to come to light is that not all these platforms are created equal. Making an image costs a lot more in terms of energy than a text prompt. They're saying that making one image might use as much energy as charging your phone. Considerations for you: Encourage students to investigate the environmental cost. Talk about it with them. Ask them to identify ways to reduce the impact of using these technologies. Get them thinking about it. And guess what? The digital divide is back. In fact, it never really went away. I was really kind of happy with this image, by the way. It took some fiddling around and doing to get Midjourney to create this image of representing the digital divide. So let's just take a moment to appreciate this. Now, I believe this is an issue that we're actually trying to address here at Xavier as we work with AI, teaching with AI. Nevertheless, let's consider some of the contours of this issue. First of all, there's not just one divide, right? There are multiple divides. There's the access divide. For example, students who have high-speed internet access at home, they can more easily use AI tools than those who have limited or no internet access at home. Students who can afford upgraded versions of AI tools like ChatGPT+ will have access to better features and functionality than those who cannot. There's a usage divide. For example, let's say that all students are given a laptop at school. The students who have family members and teachers who can show them how to use the laptops to access generative AI tools for thinking and communication and learning, well, they'll be at more of an advantage than those who do not. And some people have identified quality of use as a tertiary digital divide. That's where you've got the skills but not the knowledge, not the access to the high-quality information. And people are now saying, some scholars are now saying, it's time to declare a quaternary digital divide, a fourth digital divide, the gap between populations with functional access to generative AI and those without it, globally as a whole. That's from Professor Rewat Deonandan. This usage divide exists now. Roughly half the students in this UK survey are using AI for school, and roughly half are not. And that usage divide, of course, is racialized and gendered. And of course, so-called better students already are more likely to use AI. The students who have a higher academic performance, they're probably more likely to use AI tools than students who are not. And there are regional differences. The Gulf Coast, as you might expect, may be bringing up the rear, as some early reports indicate. Remember, we talked about language earlier, so similar to the bias in the data. Well, there's more than 7,000 languages spoken worldwide. Generative AI large language models, well, they're often trained on just a few standard languages, so this creates a quality of use divide between those who speak the languages the AI tools were trained on and those who don't. Considerations for you. How might the digital divide affect your students? Just think about it. Do they all have access to high-speed, reliable internet, high-quality devices at home, on campus? Do they have money to afford upgraded versions of AI? Do they have family members who can teach them how to use AI? How might you work to close that divide for your students, with your students? Could you provide them with learning activities that incorporate the use of AI to help your students develop their AI literacy? Could you incorporate learning activities that encourage a critical interrogation of AI? In other words, exploring the topics in all of these slides so that all your students can learn how to make informed decisions about its use in their futures. How might your students work on closing the digital divide here at Xavier, or in their community, or in Louisiana, or their state of origin, or their country of origin? After considering all these questions, all these risks, all these issues, you might have a craving for some clear policy guidelines. And those are starting to emerge at some institutions, and I think it's still, though, developing as the technology develops and as we come to terms with it. And this might be a good time to get involved in crafting those policies. I mentioned before, a lot of thanks to Tori Trust for sharing her slides and allowing them to be reused, and I've extensively modified those. This is also licensed under Creative Commons, so you can do the same. And a lot of the images, though, come from AI platforms, and the copyright status of those images is murky at best. If we were live in the room together, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can always leave a comment on this video. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Would love to hear your thoughts.